Good morning, everybody. This is Professor Tom Shakespeare in London, really welcoming you to this really important webinar. And the title is Intentional Inclusion, People with Disability and Food Security Programming. And it's part of the ongoing partnership between Trinity College Dublin and the World Food Programme. This webinar will last an hour. You can ask questions in the Q&A function. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible, but obviously time is constrained. We have a very wonderful group of people speaking who you'll really want to hear from. And I want to now turn to Amir Abdullah, who's Deputy Executive Director of the World Food Programme. And he has been implementing a whole new system within the World Food Programme from Rome, aligning the strategy, human resources, program structure, financial management, planning, monitoring, all to do with the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's a great honor, sir, to welcome Amir Abdullah, and I'd like to hand to you to introduce this event.
Thanks very much, Tom, for that kind introduction. And I really am pleased to be here to be part of this event, because today we're not only here to commemorate an important day, which tomorrow, the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, but also to really celebrate our ongoing partnership with Trinity College Dublin, which is about to enter its second year. We launched it on International Disabilities Day in 2020, last year, on the 3rd of December. Also really delighted to have with us the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities. So Gerard, Quinn, thank you very much for joining us. Now, around the world in all the areas we serve, whether it's crises, disasters, conflict-affected areas, everywhere that we respond, persons with disabilities are often the worst affected and can often find themselves, not only are they the worst affected, but find themselves excluded from the relief, recovery, and development initiatives that we undertake. Now, to ensure that WFP, Tom, you mentioned the SDGs, key amongst that is leave no one behind and reach those furthest behind first. As we take our path towards zero hunger on SDG 2, we are committed to and have to collect more and better data related to disability. And we know we can't do that alone. So we're working with partners such as Trinity College Dublin to make sure that we turn that need that we have into a reality. I'd also like to announce and mention that on the 17th of November, our executive board approved that an extension to our disability inclusion roadmap, and it was extended through until the end of 2022. And this will allow us to follow through on our commitments, which are guided by the UN Secretary General's Disability Inclusion Strategy, known as UNDIS. And our work with Trinity College Dublin is one of those commitments. And it's key as we move forward, as we develop an evidence base for the inclusion of persons with disabilities in our food security programming. And at a strategic level, we've made some encouraging steps forward with disability inclusion. It's now embedded in our new strategic plan. It's going to be reflected in a forthcoming corporate results framework, which is under finalization. All of this with a focus on adopting a people-centered approach, and that should help us move forward on the UNDIS. I'd like to also really acknowledge the governments of Australia and Finland for their ongoing support in driving this work forward, in helping with funding and prioritizing disability inclusion. Thank you to all of you who are watching this event. Many of you probably working from home in this new environment. But so thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to watch today. And a special thanks, of course, as you'd said, Tom, we've got some really excellent people to speak on the panel. So thank you to all our panelists, and a special thank you to our sign language interpreter for making this event really accessible to all, which is something we want to make sure of. And more importantly, everybody joining, thank you for being a part of this journey that we're making to make disability inclusion a reality here at WFP. With nothing about us without us, I cannot really stress enough that we can't achieve zero hunger by leaving no one behind. Tom, you'd mentioned that we've got a great panel, and conscious of time, I'd like to give the floor back to you so you can moderate the session, as we've got some pretty exciting presentations and discussions ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amir, and straight from the World Food Programme there in Rome, really important messages. All about disaggregating disability, making sure nobody is left behind, the UN effort to make sure that we have better data and we do better. And spearheading that, who could be better than Professor Jared Quinn, the UN Special Rapporteur on Disability. I've known Jared for many years, many of us have. His work on the convention, his work in Galway, setting up that centre, his professorships, several professorships, including at Leeds in the United Kingdom. He's a real example of how we should go forward in understanding the convention and applying the convention. So it's a great thrill and a pleasure and an honour to welcome you here, Jared, and we look forward very much to what you have to say, and thank you for coming.
So thank you, Amir, thank you, Chair, and thank you, colleagues. I'm particularly delighted to join with you today and happy to see the university in my country, Trinity College, play such a positive role in a very important field. And it's indeed a very special honour for me to have Tom Shakespeare as moderator. Tom, your work has inspired so many around the world, and especially your commitment to truth. Today, I would like to do just three things. First of all, I would like to zoom out a bit and talk about your overarching goal, which is inclusion. Allow me to place it in a context and explain its foundational role in the UN Disability Treaty. I see it as the heart of your work. I've long admired the work of the World Food Programme and find a lot more reason now to admire it. This was one truly deserved Nobel Prize. Secondly, allow me to talk a bit about my special interest as UN Special Rapporteur in disability before, during, and after armed conflicts. Who would have thought that some 70 years after the UN Charter clearly proscribed armed conflict, that there would be so many in the world today? Armed conflict, of course, is not the only source of hunger, but it presents acute challenges on the ground, especially for people who are often the farthest left behind. This is a much neglected topic, and I want to build a bridge between my work as UN Special Rapporteur and your work, especially in conflict and post-conflict zones. Finally, allow me to look ahead. I like to think of food as not just a basic need to be met, but as a necessary precondition for peace building. I've often found the literature on the link between economic, social, and cultural rights on the one hand, and civil and political rights on the other hand, to be dry, arid, and wholly uninspiring. Often the profound link is not brought to the surface, but your work makes that link plain beyond doubt. Obviously, you need to stay apolitical in your work. Everybody understands that. But we in the broader international community also need to value your work more in the context of rebuilding broken societies and embedding inclusion, not just as a technical conduit to deliver better food aid, but as a leitmotif for a society going forward. In my eyes, you play a vital role in nation building and peace building, and I want to paint that picture a little bit. First things first, inclusion. I had a very naive idea at the beginning of the drafting of the UN Disability Treaty, that it would just be one more instrument on a theme of equal opportunities, a sort of ADA or DDA projected onto the international sphere. I was wrong, and I was glad I was wrong. A funny thing happened on the way to the negotiations. Due entirely to the presence of people with disabilities and their representative organizations in the negotiations, something deeper bubbled to the surface. Why have good equality norms that can help you strike down bad laws if the process that allowed those bad laws appear in the first place is not fundamentally changed? This forces us to ask, what is it that generates so many of these bad laws and policies? And the answer given was invisibility, the invisibility of persons with disabilities in policy-making processes, in politics, in how systems administer laws and policies. And then one answer was to heighten the personhood of persons with disabilities. This was famously done through Article 12 on autonomy and decision-making. There are many controversies surrounding the interpretation and application of Article 12, but the big takeaway has to do with a renewed focus on the moral agency of persons with disabilities. I would go so far as to say that this notion of moral agency and personhood is one of the core pillars of the UN Disability Treaty. Let me come back to that momentarily in the context of your work. Another thing that happened on the way to the negotiations was that the concept of equality was broadened, deepened from the traditional juridical idea. It's not just about comparing how I am treated relative to you. This is often derided as a morally empty conception of equality. It now encapsulates accumulated disadvantage and acts not just as a lawyer's tool to invalidate bad laws, but as a programmatic tool or a hint of a programmatic tool to drive equality into the future. Core to this, to me, is the creative blending of economic, social, and cultural rights with civil and political rights. Practically all of the articles in the treaty are a creative blending of the two. And equality in a static sense is not the goal. Lying beneath it is a vision of inclusion. I would argue that one foundation stone of that vision of inclusion is the moral agency of persons with disabilities. So interestingly, protection, or the word protection, whenever it appears in the treaty, is not just protection in the traditional sense, but protection that actively advances the moral agency of persons with disabilities. When thinking about the impact of the treaty in fields as diverse as food aid and e-accessibility and employment, I'm often reminded of the work of Joseph Schumpeter in the 1930s. He was the one who coined the famous phrase of creative destruction. New ideas demolish the old and create space for new framings of reality and new approaches to reality. I like to think of the treaty as bringing about creative destruction. In the past, we had widely diverse and technical fields in disability with no connection to each other. Accessibility, legal capacity, education, food aid. Now we have a unified field theory in the treaty, bringing these diverse fields under one roof. This does not solve ambiguity at the core of the ideas, but it does put a common departure point under each of these fields. That's why I'm so taken with inclusion as your goal, and I'm eager to hear how the voice of persons with disabilities counts in this process of reimagining your field. A word or two about armed conflicts. This is very personal to me, as my grandmother was a victim of an armed conflict, and the intergenerational pain is very, very real. And as you know, the CRPD was unique in having a dedicated provision on emergencies and armed conflicts. What it is really getting at is the creative destruction of the CRPD relative to pre-existing fields such as international humanitarian law with its elaborate rules on civilian protection. There is a profound desideratum in international law to generate as much coherence as possible across instruments and to reduce fragmentation. Well, it turns out this idea of moral agency helps to transform and reanimate the civilian protection norms of international humanitarian law. The famous UN Security Council resolution on this topic 2 years ago says as much. It opens up conversation between two vastly different fields. My first thematic report was on the visibility or lack of visibility of persons with disabilities in the continuum within the field, ranging from conflict prevention to the conduct of hostilities, to humanitarian intervention, to peacekeeping and peace building. We mostly found invisibility. We will follow through with reports more focused on the conduct of hostilities and then one specifically on peace building, putting the accent on the moral agency of persons with disabilities even during crises. I imagine without knowing that this agenda spills over with yours. I imagine that many food crises happen during or in the immediate aftermath of conflicts. I imagine most of them are conflicts within borders, making them even more intractable. And I imagine some are not beyond using food as a weapon of war. And I imagine food as a vital part of nation building and peace building. It would be nice to explore in more detail the overlap of interest and work between my work as UN Special Rapporteur and your work in the World Food Programme. Finally, looking ahead, how do I look down on and see your work? Well, as before mentioned, what's interesting to me is how your work brings vividly to life the much vaunted bond between economic and social rights with civil and political rights. All societies need this bond, especially when entering a period of renewal and mending. Extreme stress breeds extreme political polarization, or the tendency of societies to fracture along narrow sectarian lines is heightened when basic needs are left untended to. And even when they are technically tended to, but in a way that ignores the voice of those directly concerned, it can have the effect of cementing into place dividing lines. So I tend to see inclusion as something you can and should do in your work within your field, but I see it as a longer-term output of effective food inclusion, much broader ramifications for the self-renewal of broken societies. In conclusion, we are all undergoing a process of translation of inclusion and moral agency across many, many domains hitherto kept apart, like food. Your journey is of great interest to many others going down a similar path, but in different domains. And I very much look forward to your observations and questions. And back to you, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jared. That was fantastic. And your point about visibility is so important. And it reminded me when I worked at the WHO, one of my tasks was to further the task force on disability, which is very like what our colleague Amir has said about the UN system becoming more accessible. And I went round to 54 directors at the WHO main building in Geneva and said, well, what are you going to do about disabled people? And the first thing they said to me, most of them, was not that they weren't prepared to do it, but what is the evidence that disabled people, people with disabilities, are at particular risk in this area? So I think you're right, absolutely right. We have to start with inclusion and visibility, but we also have to get down to some data and evidence. And partly for that reason, and to support your comments, we have some more people joining the panel. And the idea here is that our friends in the audience, please ask your questions in a Q&A box function, we'll try to answer them. But to answer them with Jared, Dr. Caroline Jago, she's Assistant Professor in the Department of Clinical Speech and Language Studies at Trinity, and she has been really driving this World Food Programme TCD partnership. She's obviously a therapist, but she's worked in South Africa and Ireland. She's been collaborating in Ethiopia, India, and Iraq, and so she knows a hell of a lot about disability inclusion. So welcome, Caroline. And with her, Claire O'Reilly is a researcher at Trinity College Dublin, again, part of this partnership with World Food Programme. She's a physio. She's also worked in many settings in Africa and the Middle East, and has done a lot of research. She has been working with the Lancet AUB Commission on Syria. Next, we have Hashim Zaidi, who's head of the urban programme at the World Food Programme office in Zimbabwe, but he's also been deployed to support the emergency response in Afghanistan. He's worked in across Asia and Africa, social safety nets, emergency trust transfers, resilience building, all things which will speak to our disability theme. And finally, but not least, we have Murali Padmanabhan, who is the Regional Disability Inclusion Advisor. So he's really walking the walk, not just talking the talk, with WFP in the Asia Pacific region. He's based in Bangkok. He's been working with other disabled people for the past 25 years through international organizations, through inclusion, through resource mobilization and advocacy. So we've got a really good panel for you. Just a reminder, put your questions in the Q&A. You can ask to any of these folk, or including Jared. But let me start off. It's really a question or a comment to Caroline. And it's before we get down to the detail, the specific questions. What is this project connecting the World Food Programme and Trinity College? How come you got lucky?
I definitely got lucky, Tom, but we're now in our second year of partnering with WFP, and the focus has moved towards qualitative data as evidence to guide inclusive programming. The first year was much more focused on quantitative, disaggregated data. This qualitative data is really the data that's critical to people-centered approaches because it contextualizes and localizes what's needed, in this case to achieve inclusion of food insecure persons with disability in a specific context or a specific food assistance program. So our work at the moment has got two sides. Firstly, we're exploring how, in the context of WFP's work, the processes involved in accountability to affected populations or community engagement, AAP processes, can be optimally accessible to persons with disabilities. So that's about making sure that food insecure persons with disabilities can access the information provided by WFP, and really critically that they have the opportunity to be heard and shape decisions. So removing that invisibility, that their voices and stories are important. Those stories are the evidence of who is in need and why. Their feedback is evidence in terms of issues that have arisen preventing access to assistance. And we need to make sure that these are properly captured and analyzed. And that's the second focus, because in fast moving, time sensitive and very complex contexts, which are all the contexts in which WFP works, qualitative data is not necessarily easy or the natural solution. So we are exploring with different country offices feasible and robust ways to ensure that the data from inclusive community engagement processes is analyzed and gathered in a way that's both inclusive but also feasible. And this work has been happening alongside a larger portfolio of disability inclusion at WFP as it unfolds. So the fact that we're there alongside, since the disability inclusion roadmap kicked off, allows us to look in real time at what's working and then disseminate learning that's immediately applicable and refined by context. So our attention is spreading beyond the initial pilot countries, and we've seen transfer of learning from Central African Republic to Mozambique and to Zimbabwe for large-scale retargeting processes, for example. So it's been a really exciting time to work with WFP.
Thank you so much. And can I now turn to Hashim? And really it's about how did disability come to be a major consideration in the urban retargeting exercise?
Thanks, Tom, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone. And greetings from a sunny Kabul for a change. It's been exceptionally cold these past few days, but thanks, Tom, for that question. So in Zimbabwe, actually, we started our urban program in 2019, and the urban program itself was something sort of a new thing that WFP was doing at the time. And as you're aware, within urban communities, the communal structures are not very well defined. So our usual targeting approach that we adopt in most rural centers, which is community-based, proved to be really tricky. So then WFP adapted, and we sort of designed our targeting approach based on looking at various factors of vulnerability, and disability was definitely one of them. But when we concluded our targeting exercise, what we realized was that despite accounting for disability as one of the key factors of vulnerability, we were still able to only target less than 2% of our total beneficiary pool with people who classified themselves as people with disabilities, while the census figure was over about, I think, 6% at the time. So that was sort of the first factor, which sort of made us wonder, why was this particular group so heavily underrepresented? Then the second factor, which was that we were approached by organizations representing people with disabilities, asking about the targeting process, the targeting factors, and the fact that they felt in some cases that they had been excluded from the process. So when we started the retargeting exercise, and this is why, 6 months into the program, we decided that we wanted to do a retargeting exercise. So we collaborated with our HQ colleagues and also with Trinity College Dublin. And we sort of sought their technical advice on how to tweak our instrument and design in a way that it's more inclusive, and we're able to make sure that people with disabilities are duly represented within our sample size. So we tweaked our design. We worked quite a bit on training our field staff, training our enumerators, so that we make sure that the data that we're collecting is being done in a way that is truly representative of the vulnerable population that we want to support. I think on top of that, what was, because whenever there's a question about inclusion, it requires coordination at all possible levels. So I think we changed our entire targeting approach. So what we did was we came up with a way through which we did consultation with multi-stakeholders, including government, civil society organizations, resident associations, and in particular, organizations representing people with disabilities, so that we make sure that when we're defining hunger hotspots, as we call them, where we conduct our surveys, we're making sure that we're engaging with the most vulnerable parts of the community, and their voices are heard when we're designing and finalizing our targeting instrument. So that's how it all happened. But I think the coordination and support from our donors, the support from the government, and then also the support from the leadership was very, very important. I think for us, one of the key challenges, and this is a question that I was faced with again and again, and a lot of different groups raised this, is just because you're a person with disability, does that automatically qualify you for assistance under a WFP food assistance program? And I think this is where, I think, Tom, you and Jared were talking about evidence. I think that's where we need more investment and more data, looking at, trying to understand the correlation between the two, and how inclusivity and how vulnerability, is defined, especially in urban contexts. I think for us, accountability to affected populations is absolutely key for WFP. And that was one of the main drivers why we wanted to, do a retargeting exercise, so that we make sure that we're targeting the right set of stakeholders and addressing vulnerability across the board. And just to conclude, I think what our experience in Zimbabwe shows us is that both qualitative and quantitative data is critical for informed decision making. If we had not analyzed that, our beneficiary pool had less than 2% of beneficiaries with people with disabilities, we would have never taken that decision to actually do a retargeting exercise so soon into our program implementation. So I think it's critical that we continue to think about ways through which we collect both qualitative and quantitative data around issues to do with disability and around inclusion, and make sure that we use it to make informed decision making. Let me stop here for now. Thanks. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Hashim. And I think that's really important, because disabled people, we're all different, and we're not all vulnerable. Some of us are very vulnerable at certain times and in certain situations. And we've seen that with the COVID-19 pandemic. Some people are much more vulnerable than others, clinically, but also because of the barriers that they face. So thank you for doing that very important work. Murali, I'm going to come to you now. So this is a really good example that we've heard from Hashim from Zimbabwe. So you're in the Regional Bureau of Bangkok. How is this sort of particular example spread? What are you doing widely around your region to promote the inclusion of disabled people?
Okay, thank you, Tom. Thanks. Yes, when we are just completing 15 years of the UNCRPD, and this year focusing on leadership and partnership, participation, it's the right time RBB, which happened to be the pilot program when it comes to disability inclusion. We are taking the inspiration from the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. We got our roadmap for the whole WFP, RBB becoming the first region to roll out with our own detailed implementation, which is beyond the program. It's not trying to look at people with disabilities as just a beneficiary. We want to see how people with disabilities could play a vital role, influencing role. This is where we really believe and practice in engaging with organizations of people with disabilities. We are trying to bring them on board for each and every consultation where we are going to impact our policies and programs. Every unit in the organization, in the region or in the headquarters, we try to revisit our current policies and how we can amend. And it's conducively happening because of the leadership and the commitment with the conviction and the perspective. These are all the key elements that are enabling us to move forward. When it comes to capacity building, we have the supports from partners like Trinity College Dublin, and every day we are getting their supports, and they are able to reach out to our country offices, colleagues who are really committed, who are really motivated. That's the story behind our progress. And again, people want to do, because disability, they don't see it as a kind of a small entity or a non-existing part. And our commitment to sustainable development goal, particularly goal number 2, and fulfilling the principle of leaving no one behind. These are all the conducive factors that are really helping us. So what we are doing with the support from Finland government and the DFAT, we are trying to pilot some of the initiatives, looking at some of our programs, how it works, what does it mean to people with disabilities. For example, school nutrition program. How does it impact children with disabilities? How does it incentivize children with disabilities? Looking at some of our major interventions and how we can integrate disability rather than a standalone target, and how the other intersectionalities, it's not disability as a standalone domain. We always believe and propagate among colleagues. It cuts across every other marginalization. Today, in fact, we had one such evidence where we had the impact of COVID or gender-based violence among women and girls with disabilities. So it is well embedded in our actions. Again, every event, we ensure that people with disabilities are able to participate. We try to address the issue of barriers, and we try to reach out to anyone who is in need of our help, because people want to do things, but they want to know how to do it. So that's the key message we have. And every country office, for that matter, they really apply themselves, they really motivate, and they give their support, even come forward to guide the team to bring on board disability as a transformative change in their work. I will stop here. Thank you. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you so much, Murali. And that's so much more detail and exactly what we need for understanding. I'm going to go now to Claire O'Reilly, and she is obviously part of this partnership that we're celebrating today. So how can we ensure that these changes, which we know the World Food Programme is implementing, are aligned with the experiences, needs and capacities of persons with disabilities? Over to you, Claire.
Yeah, thank you for that important question. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be with all of you this morning, this afternoon, all times around the world. You know, we heard this from Amir in the opening remarks, this idea of nothing about us without us. And this is the motto that underpins the disability rights movement. Consultation is a central pillar of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. And it's something that's really important to this work that we're doing with WFP. Caroline and I have been lucky to speak with so many colleagues dedicated to the idea of making programming at WFP so much more inclusive. But I think it's really important that we essentially close that loop and make sure that it's not just us speaking to each other as practitioners about what we think will work, but that we're speaking to people with disabilities who are accessing the services of WFP or trying to access the services of WFP, and making sure that we're taking their perspectives into account. So we've been working last year with a big focus on the quantitative data. We're moving into more of the qualitative data in terms of, you know, what does this mean for WFP programming? What are maybe the barriers that people with different disabilities, intersecting identities, as Murali speaks to, what are the challenges that they're facing? And how are we making sure that WFP can hear from these people and can implement the relevant changes? So over the next few months, we're going to be undertaking field visits with a number of offices, country offices, some of whom you've already heard reference to today, and other country offices that are already undertaking ways of making sure that they're being held to account by people with disabilities, and they're implementing their views and what they do. So really we're moving forward with closing that loop and making sure that what we do speaks to the perspectives, the needs and the capacities of people with disabilities through WFP's programming.
Thank you very much indeed. And now it's a great honor. There are two countries in the world, there are many countries in the world I've been to and enjoyed, but there are two in particular, and one is Australia. And it's a great pleasure because I know that these two countries have been a great assistance in this effort to include people with disabilities. And it's a great honor to introduce Ambassador Margaret Toomey, who's going to make a few comments now.
Thank you, Professor Tom. Can you all hear me? Greetings, greetings from Australia's home in Rome. Hope you like my Irish name, by the way. Look, you can tell a seminar's been a success when all the questions you've stored up to the end have been answered during the seminar. So absolutely everything I wanted to ask you, I think has been very well addressed. So I guess I want to thank you for putting this on and to acknowledge the high quality of this discussion. It's lovely to meet you all. I haven't met any of you before. Virtual introductions are not as good as in-person ones, but my goodness, we can span the world in so much more effective ways by doing it this way. Perhaps I'll just note that it's a real pleasure to be able to represent Australia's contribution to this aspect of FP work on food security. It's a personal passion for me, disability. My grandfather worked for about the last 40 years of his life looking after victims of leprosy in the South Pacific. That was essentially working on a leper colony island. And at the end of his time doing that, and he was not doing it in the medical field, he was raising money to make them more visible and give them the recognition and a quality of life that they deserved, and to find the ability in disability. And I could talk for ages on some of the things that were achieved during that period. But he actually died in Fiji the year I was born. And just after multi-drug therapy had been found. And so with scientific work, we've been able to see an end to leper colony islands. So I kind of feel like that's a metaphor, and that I actually arrived in Fiji the day he died. So we never got to meet each other. I was a baby. But I felt like there was a little bit of a metaphorical handover at an end of an era and the beginning of another one. So while I was in Fiji, yes, DFAT, our Foreign Services work on disability, was an important part of my job. My interests extended way beyond that. A more general observation in the various, I've had 7 overseas postings and as an Australian diplomat, and alarm bells ring, first of all, when you don't see anyone around you on the street with an obvious disability. Disability is often hidden, and as I know from my time in Fiji, talking to ongoing victims of leprosy, or patients of leprosy, let's not call them victims, they're doing well nowadays. But talking to them and their families about the history of the Pacific story, that stigma is still an issue. And it's something we all need to understand when we do our work and collect our data and do our planning. Data often doesn't come from the census. In many countries the WFP works in, I'm guessing there are no censuses to draw off. There are in Fiji and East Timor, but I don't think they're ever going to collect the kind of data that we need to be as effective as we need to be, or to optimise our work. You're unlikely to get the full picture from the host government, or even the wonderful disability organisations that I'm sure you've all been exposed to. And nor, as you've all said, is data collection of value if it's only about numbers and locations. So, you know, Amir made the point straight out about the people-centred approach. Jared, you talked about invisibility. It's a huge challenge, huge. Professor Tom, you talked about so many things, but the importance of data. And Caroline, the points you made about stories and feedback, how they need to be captured and need to be analysed. Absolutely important. It's really only when you're invited into a family's home that you can start to understand the experience, the lived experience. And really importantly, I don't think we've talked a lot about yet, although I think it's implicit, about cultural context. Every country, well, from my experience in the Pacific, is culturally very distinct. It's not one great Pacific monolith out there. Different cultural systems, different tribal systems all understand and treat disability in different ways. And it's incumbent on us when we're in the field to get out there and learn about it, not intrusively, and that takes you know, a very gentle touch to work your way into confidence with the local organisations to start with, but even they won't capture everything. So I guess I would like to re-emphasise the value that Australia puts on using local organisations and doing what we can, as you've already suggested, to help those local organisations do better. And I'd be interested in any ideas you have on how to do that. And Murali's point about helping people with disability play a vital influencing role. On the cheerful side, I've seen some really great things, particularly in Fiji on that. The work that's been done over recent decades has been quite something. Disability organisations do have a voice. I'm not sure how many people and how many circumstances they represent, but they do a good job doing what they can, and it is incumbent on us to help them do more and encourage the media to look at the question of disability a bit better. Again, in Fiji, they do that pretty well. So so some happy stories there. And Claire's point about field visits, well, I just can't emphasize enough how much my own experience that's really been important to understanding what we do. The information, the stats are important. We all know that in all forms of development cooperation, but understanding the context is essential. So I'm thrilled by everything you said. I think we all understand each other really well about what's needed. I'm a little bit jealous of those who actually get to work in the field. I miss that at the moment. And I wish you well. You've got a really important job to do. I think it takes time and hard work to get to what we're talking about. It's a big investment, but the reward is in having so much more impact with what WFP can do. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And reminder that if you can't be in Australia, being ambassador to Rome is pretty good.
It's all right.
It's all right. So now, the other wonderful place that has been so supportive to this program and is such a wonderful commitment to disabled people is Finland. And so I'm very happy to ask Minna Mahahedi, who is the special advisor in Finland, to take on the talk next, please.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks so much for the opportunity to show my support, similarly to Ambassador Toomey, for WFP's fantastic work in this area. Finland's an active champion of the rights of persons with disabilities and inclusion of them in humanitarian emergencies, and particularly in vulnerable situations. We've supported the implementation of WFP's Disability Inclusion Roadmap, and we warmly welcome the work on disability data and the collaboration with Trinity College Dublin. I'm just going to keep it really brief because I see that there are other people who have questions as well. And I just wanted to speak to the point of the link with data and what Gerard mentioned in terms of the invisibility of persons with disabilities, and also what Ambassador Toomey just mentioned as well. So, so data, absolutely agreed, as the panelists have mentioned, is vital for informed decision making. And that's, I feel, the most important use. And it's really good to see that through this work with Trinity College, that the learnings are being spread to throughout WFP more broadly. So piloting and then spreading it globally is and scaling it up, I think, is very important. We're currently going through a process where we are preparing a report on Finland's contribution to development and humanitarian action globally. And as part of this exercise, because we are committed to the implementation of persons with disabilities, we also want to highlight progress in this area. And one of the challenges is really the lack of data, the global lack of data. So this work that you're doing in WFP, I have a question on how you see that data progressing to the more global level. So for example, making it visible in the WFP's dashboard, for example, or you know, are you collecting that kind of data and developing those kinds of processes that would make that data visible on a global level? I think that that's really important, not only for the informed decision making, like I mentioned, which is probably the most important, or the use of it, but also to be an example for other agencies, other organizations, especially humanitarian agencies, to see the work that WFP is doing on disability inclusion, on this disability data, as well as for us to be able to track globally what's happening. So a question to the panelists on how you see that working out, and when we might start seeing the data on WFP's dashboard. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, we haven't got much time. We've got quite a few questions. And I want to go straight to Hashim, very briefly, if you would. Does WFP targeting capture the intersectional needs of women with disabilities? So I'm going to ask Hashim that question, please.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, thanks for that question. Yes, it does. Actually, we do realize that disability, gender, and discrimination are all at some level linked. So there is a linkage there, and that's something that the targeting instrument takes into account. What I can say in the interest of time is we are working on publishing our targeting approach and our lessons learned from Zimbabwe, which I think should hopefully be externally available in a couple of months, and then I think that could be a useful document that would provide insights onto this further and our targeting approach itself. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to ask Murali now, and really I want 3 tips from you. What advice can you give to an NGO, to an international NGO, to ensure inclusion of disabled people internally in the organization and also within their programs? Have you got 3 tips for us, please, there, Murali?
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, if you ask me, let's look at disability as an integral part of our work among the people who we are serving, because never isolate them and never go for a specific program, never approach disability from a very traditional approach. Disability has to be mainstreamed. Look at every aspect of your work and what does it mean to, are we really including people with disabilities? Are we institutionalizing the issue of people with disabilities? Are we ensuring reasonable accommodation? Because sometimes reasonable accommodation is treated as additional cost or a privilege cost, which is not. I would say it's appropriate expenses to ensure equal opportunity. Plus, build the capacity of people and not to look at disability as a kind of something from another planet, and try to involve everyone, right from hiring to human resources or admin. Everyone should be on the same page, and if we have that same language in the organization, then we are there. It's mainly the attitude of each one of us in the organization. Then the other issues can be addressed, be it accessibility, be it communication or participation. That would be my broader tips for any NGO. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So Claire, very briefly, what do we know about the relationship between food insecurity and disability in the sort of places that a World Food Programme is working?
Yeah, to answer this question, we almost need to start the clock over. But what I can say is, look, we know a huge amount and we also don't know enough. So I think it's important to say that when we are talking about needing more data and needing more evidence, it's not that we need to wait until we have new data or evidence to begin thinking about disability inclusion. There are actions that we can be taking now. With that said, I think things that people can consider are, one, what is the sort of crisis or context type that you're in? If we're in a conflict or post-conflict setting, as Jared has spoken to, you're going to have an increase in disability creation and different impairment types. If we're in a displacement crisis, then we're going to have people with disabilities who maybe previously weren't vulnerable, existed in a supportive social setting, who now are outside of that and are experiencing new vulnerabilities, new difficulties in accessing basic needs like food. And then also to think about the temporal element. So WFP has that saving lives, but also the changing lives agenda. And so maybe we might be doing a good job at looking at vulnerability in an acute crisis, but how does that change for people with disabilities over time? If there's a child with a disability who hasn't been able to access school in a protracted crisis, what does that mean over time for their ability to engage in meaningful work, provide for their own basic needs, and so on? So I think we don't need to wait to act, but there are contextual factors that we need to think about in each of the different settings where WFP acts in terms of what it needs to know further.
Thank you. There's a question, a really important question about how this affects UN's work. And I also want to put this to Jared, if you don't mind. Here we have a really good example of the World Food Programme really putting disabled people within the mix. In your experience, can we get this message across to other UN agencies, or is it already happening?
Yeah, I think it's already happening, Tom, and people are going down their own paths, and it'd be really useful to share the experience of the World Food Programme with others. For example, peacekeeping operations are beginning to understand the importance of voice and human agency and participation, and they're beginning to make efforts in that direction. Likewise, the political branch of the UN involved in peace building operations is beginning down that journey. So I think we're all on a common journey, and it'd be useful to begin sharing notes. I would just add that from my point of view, what's really useful to me in this seminar is the focus you've had on invisibility. I think that's exactly right. The focus you've had on voice and participation, and I think that's exactly right. And I think also the focus on intersectionality deserves further exploration. And indeed, your point, Tom, that we can't automatically make assumptions about poverty and vulnerability and disability, which is a really interesting point. And also the point arising that is really stimulating is about the cultural diversity in the different cultural contexts within which we think of food security. Absolutely fascinating to me. I'm really, really thankful to have been part of this today.
Thank you, Jared. I want to go to Caroline Quinn for the final, Caroline Jago for the final comment. And it's really about how we learn from this and how we put it on the map of the World Food Programme. We've heard from Murali and Hashim how it happens at regional and local level, but how can we make sure, as we were challenged by Mina, how does this get onto the dashboard, as it were?
Yeah, and I think that's both to do with just the great motivation and the learning attitude of WFP as a whole. So, you know, definitely we're already getting questions about what can we put on the dashboard? What do we have already? And the organization in that sense is almost moving faster than we can actually do the work. So it is sharing it in that sense. And then it's also the grassroots piece that people are talking to each other and people are asking, well, can you tell us a country that's really doing this? We want to see it. So, you know, Hashim's talking about this paper that we're working on, and there's people waiting with bated breath to understand how Zim has done that and transfer it to other countries. So I think it's really just about us keeping up with the pace of WFP wanting to implement this learning and just sharing it in strategic ways.
We're lucky to have Kavita also on the call, and maybe Kavita Brambat could say a little bit also about how the interagency works. That question I asked to Jared. Kavita, would you be able to just briefly add a minute or two?
Yeah, sure. I'll just add on to what Caroline said about making sure this gets on the dashboard, and what Amir had mentioned earlier about the strategic plan and embedding it in WFP's strategic plan. That's been a long and hard journey, but we've finally got it in, and really thanks to our donors, Australia and Finland, but other nations as well. Getting it in there was the first step. Now reporting to those results, which is in the corporate results framework, is the way we'll get that data to make some relevant sense within the work while we work in. And in terms of the interagency context, particularly in conflict settings, as one of the Kirsten Young had asked from OHCHR, we're on the Disability Reference Group for the Interagency Standing Committee. And this is a group that includes 80 different organizations, UN organizations, NGOs, and organizations of people with disabilities, where we talk about how to implement disability inclusive humanitarian action concretely in the field. And this is something that we're working on and have been working on for the last 2 years. So this is a visible sign of interagency collaboration. And then finally, the FCDO attempts to very much embed disability data within the humanitarian planning cycle is something that has been going on probably for the last 3 years, where we've really seen this emphasis in humanitarian needs overviews and humanitarian response plans on how and what are the effects of the humanitarian crises on people with disabilities and what our response will be. So I guess these are the kind of interactions with the rest of the world, and hopefully at some time we'll see what the results are. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Kavita. And we are, I'm afraid, winding up the session. So thanks to Kavita, to Murali in Bangkok, to Hashim currently in Afghanistan, but normally in Zimbabwe, to Claire and Caroline, both in Dublin, with this wonderful partnership, to our dear advisor, Mina, and our ambassador from Rome, and particularly to Jared Quinn, who gave us the keynote today. It's wonderful to have you at the UN Special Rapporteur level. You have been with this Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities from the start. And I think that what we're seeing now with the inclusion of disability issues in the World Food Programme, in the other UN agencies, in the national efforts, is really welcome. And I know that you're there fighting for us and making sure those voices are heard. So thank you very much to Trinity College Dublin. Thank you to everybody who participated. I'm very sorry we didn't have room for all the questions, but hopefully you will have learned from the contributions of our panel and our keynotes and our guests. Obviously, thanks to our sign language interpreters, and have a wonderful International Day of Persons with Disabilities. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.